Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Veritas Fact-Finding Series. And today, I'm joined by my guest, Professor Paul Kershaw. Good morning, Paul.
So great to be with you.
We're back on the ground to speak with industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. And if you're watching and you like what you hear, give us a like and follow us at www.veritascorp.com. A quick note disclaimer, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants and or employees of the Veritas group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. And while we love all our guests, and Paul in particular, this session may contain forward-looking statements, investment opinions, and comments that we may not agree with, although that could be a challenge given what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to step back from markets to examine a deeper force that's shaping Canada's economy, policy, and most importantly, its social fabric, the generational squeeze. My guest, Dr. Paul Kershaw, is a professor at UBC, wait for it, in the Faculty of Medicine, where he's teaching healthy public policy and focused on where we're talking about today. He's founder of Generational Squeeze, a think tank or a think and change tank focused on intergenerational fairness. His work challenges a core assumptions many Canadians hold, that each generation will do better than the last. Many of his ideas have challenged deeply embedded assumptions around things that we're going to talk about: ownership, taxation, resources, and growth itself. Today, I want to explore not only the diagnosis, but also whether the proposed solutions risk creating new trade-offs around incentives, investment, and economic growth. Paul, before we get into the meat of the discussion, everyone is about where they came from and why they do what they do. I'm going to ask you, how did you get into teaching? Why do you do what you do and get involved in generational squeeze?
Yeah, well, thanks for the really kind introduction. And my story is, a story that will likely resonate with many. I'm deeply influenced by my parents, in particular. My mother has a level of empathy that regularly blows me away, and she spent her career as a teacher working with children who have extra support needs, or adults who had various developmental difficulties they needed help with, or refugees and so on. And throughout my childhood, I just saw that my mom had a great deal of energy to devote to people who were, getting the short end of the stick, and wanted to help them have as much security as possible, which I tremendously admired. But I also noticed that after my mom helped one person to get a stronger foundation, there was a long line of people waiting for her next bit of care. And in response to her constantly having this long line of people waiting for her attention, I wondered if I could organize my career around trying to shorten the number of people in the line. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about what are the policy choices that create the systems that result in some people having more financial insecurity, and how can we get rid of that and lift everyone to have a strong foundation so that they can have enough time and money to enjoy life, an opportunity to work hard and have that work pay off, and a chance to leave a legacy for their own family, their community, and their country.
Love it. Paul, if I might, what's your mother's name?
My mom is Sue Kershaw.
Sue, cheers to you. Thanks for creating such a good human that's Canadian here to make this world a better place for us. All right. You've said publicly that Canada's promise is fading for younger generations. What was the moment or data that made that sort of undeniable for you?
Yeah, I think the data are now beyond contestation. Undeniable. I like that language. They are beyond contestation when it comes to hard work doesn't pay off today like it used to. And so I just want to be very clear. People across generations have been working hard, but right now the data show that if you're a millennial or a Gen Z, people who are younger than me, hard work isn't paying off for them like it used to, especially for baby boomers. And here's the story the data tell. A typical young adult today will go to post-secondary more now to try and land a job. They'll pay more for the privilege to do so and take more student debt on as a result. They then will land jobs that, if you adjust for inflation, pay less than was paid on average to boomers back in the day. And so going to school longer to land jobs that pay less, they less often have generous pensions or extended health benefits. Then they face housing, which is really transforming everything. And housing is so much more expensive. It's pushing home ownership out of reach for longer periods of time. The consolation prize is lousy, rising rents. And that is sort of the private vice grip in which people find themselves in our economy, working harder to to earn less to face way higher housing prices. That's the financial squeeze. And then they end up delaying. They'll delay moving out of their parents' home, delay starting their lives with a lover and significant other. They delay starting their families, and that is why we now have, for instance, a much higher average age of birthing than we did several decades ago. So that delay is a big outcome of a financial foundation that is harder to achieve, and that's because our economy simply does not reward hard work like it used to.
Wow. Does not reward hard work. You worked hard in your life to get where you are.
I am, and I mean, my story is a perfect example of it. So I've been a homeowner now for 22 years. I bought into the market in 2004 in Metro Vancouver at a price that at the time seemed outrageous. I remember my mom saying, "You should be buying a castle for the amount of money." It's like as much money for your one home as the three homes she'd ever owned before. But the reality is, if someone's just as smart as me and just as hardworking as me, they now would not be able to live where I do in Metro Vancouver. It's just not in reach. And so here's a stat that I think will alarm your listeners. In 1976, when my mom was a young woman, just starting to raise me, it took 5 years of full-time work to save a 20% down payment on an average priced home in Metro Vancouver, in BC, in Ontario, the GTA, and across Canada. There wasn't a lot of variation. But if you flash forward to today, it's more like 14 years on average across Canada, closer to 18 in Ontario, 20 in BC, 21 in the GTA, and a whopping 24 years in Metro Vancouver. You literally, in many of our biggest cities, need to start saving in childcare for the home you would like to have as a young adult. The problem is, though, childcare is pretty expensive in most places and costs another rent or mortgage size payment. So it's difficult to save in your childcare years.
So, but is this just a function of our society maturing? Because this is not a Canadian only situation, right? This is something that's occurring across the developed and even developing countries, where the younger generation just can't afford. Like even in China, the younger generation is taking longer to get married, to move out. It's like it's a whole process that's occurring everywhere. And so I wonder, in Canada's situation, is it just sort of part of policy that came in place, where you had interest rates on a global basis starting, if you go back in 1981, when I think everything started and the world changed in this dramatic fashion, right? You had interest rates sitting at double digits, and essentially they've made their way pretty steadily. There's been some blips up and upward, but generally, if you look at the chart, they've gone down to essentially zero during COVID. Okay.
Yep.
And if you just simple math, this is why incomes haven't had to move, because your ability to that $1,000 payment or whatever the payment you had for your house, it can just go further. And this is happening all over the world.
Yeah. So, what's happening in Canada is not necessarily unique to our country. I would say that within Canada, the States, England, Australia, New Zealand, there's a commonality that is somewhat distinct from other places. And I would say, with regards to housing affordability, we need to recognize it is particularly problematic here. We have the biggest gaps between earnings and average home values. And I love your focus on interest rates and thinking about that over decades, because there are multiple factors that have driven housing values higher and higher. And let's be clear, for some people like me, that's been golden.
Correct.
I already told you, I bought in 2004. My single detached home in Metro Vancouver is worth over $1 million, easily more than what I have put into this home. And I gained that while I was sleeping and watching television and cleaning up the kitchen after dinner. But it's those higher values that now make it harder for that just a smart person as Paul Kershaw, but he's 25 years younger than me, to get into the market. And so we had 25 years in Canada, starting around 2000, where we said, home values are rising. They're rising, especially in BC. Then we spread to Ontario, and then in the pandemic everywhere. And at first, we weren't too worried about it. Indeed, our premiers of the day were like, well, we don't want to really stall home values because it's driving up people's equity. And why would we want to harm their equity? But in 2015, I remember, that's the first time Gen Squeeze really sounded the alarm. And we said, there's a code red in British Columbia. Premier Christy Clark, please note that rising home values are crushing kids and grandchildren of existing homeowners today, and we need to find a better balance. And the problem is politicians were really nervous at the time to say, well, we want home values to slow down. And I think that failure politically to have a clear goal for what we wanted from home values 10, 15 years ago, let them continue to rise and rise and rise. And it's just so much harder to put the genie back in the bottle after home values are as high as they are today. And interest rates are a big part of that. Let's talk about that more as the conversation goes forward.
But who wants to be the government? Remember, the government has a set life. They got a certain number of years in power. We can get into many discussions here about, democracy at some level, but let's just move in with how it is. But that's everything's interrelated, right? You have the majority, the voting population, their owners, because our home ownership sits at 66, 67%. That's actually below the OECD average, yeah? And below several European countries that are thought to be renter countries. This is the part that I think we need to pedal and dig through carefully, because is renting that bad? Because if you go to these other societies, Germany, Spain, Italy, UK, renting is just a matter of life. Let's now, I started buying real estate in 1991. And so now let's just think about this. I made choices. Everybody makes choices. And yes, you're right. To income, we are the highest in the world and have been for some time. And that's a big problem. But at the same time, and we debated this at our housing conference this past year, which I'm going to ask you if you want to be part of. I'd love to have you come and speak because it'd be a great platform in front of our clients. But in any event, we debated whether being a renter society is all that bad. And
yeah, so I think it's exactly the right question. And the answer is, in some cultural contexts, no. It actually is quite the norm. Even in Quebec, within Canada, there's much more of a renter cultural context.
In Quebec,
but in much of the Canadian context, it plays out that renters are second-class neighbors, and our public policy often enforces that. The renter can't use her RRSP to, save up to pay her rent. But the first-time home buyer can be using their RRSP to be saving their down payment and then building the equity that comes from making that purchase of a home. And that's just one example. And let's be clear, there is something about the Canadian expectations of a middle-class experience that really revolve around a sense of security. Can I send my kid to that childcare for the next few years? Can they go to the same school for the next many years? And I'm in control of that because I can't be evicted. That has really evolved over the last couple of decades for the generations that are following in my footsteps. And it's contributing to a widening gap of security between age groups. And in fact, it's contributing to a happiness gap in our country by age. If you'll let me just report the latest global happiness report data.
Please.
It's found that Canadian retirees rank in the top 8 countries in the world in terms of levels of happiness. Those who are younger, 30, 35 and under, 30 and under, if I'm remembering correctly, they're 50 spots lower. 50 spots lower. And indeed, the Canadian scholars who've been looking into this global data have found that the drop in happiness in Canada for young people over the last 15 to 20 years is so great, it only rivals the drop in happiness reported in countries like Venezuela, Afghanistan, and Lebanon. Let that sink in for your listeners. The drop in happiness amongst young people in Canada is so great, it rivals some of the, the drop in happiness we see in some just countries that many would describe as like their economies are failing, their civil society is failing. And so we need young and old alike to lean in right now and say something is happening in Canada that is compromising the standard of living for younger Canadians, which is then compromising their well-being.
So I love that. I'm so glad you're bringing that up. The question is, there's many questions. One of the things to consider is, well, is it just the house? Because, there's a policy which you mentioned, which is important that you didn't touch on, but kind of around you did, which is the fact that we have our principal residence not being taxed, right? If we just change that and make it that all of a sudden there's tax on your principal residence, it changes the economics. It changes my decision of whether I want to buy. And we have in this country a big problem of productivity, such that it makes my blood boil that we have so much opportunity and we're not investing in it. And the reason is, well, part of the reason, because there's no correlation directly, but there's part of the reason is I can borrow money to buy a property of any kind. If I buy it personally, they'll lend it to me at low single digits. But same human, knock on the door and say, I want to borrow money for my Veritas group of companies that is cash flow positive for 26 years and growing steadily. They say, sure, Mr. Shilapati, if you want to guarantee it, happy to lend you the money. And so we're missing the boat. We actually support buying property because that has been kind of like, created all kinds of wealth.
Well, let's have our blood boil together on this issue for a few more minutes and dig in a bit deeper. So this isn't a conversation I always have in the podcast that I do, but I just love the getting into the productivity issue early on and recognizing how it's tied to actually our dysfunctional housing system. Yes. And so you've nailed it. There are tax incentives that incline people to borrow and borrow and borrow to bid up the price of something that already exists, because the after-tax returns on that kind of investment are particularly good. And then our chartered banks actually have a practice of being much more comfortable lending for people to bid up the price of some asset that already exists, rather than lending so people can borrow and build new industries, build new companies that drive our productivity, drive the greening of our economy as we're dealing with extreme weather, drive manufacturing, etc., drive innovations in AI. And so we need a fundamental shift in the incentives that our regulators are giving to chartered banks in terms of their lending practices, and tax policy is it's incentivizing how Canadians borrow money and then where they invest it. And we got to move away from an economy that's growing our GDP because we're pumping up real estate rental and leasing, but most of the pumping is simply borrowing more to bid up the price of a home that already exists. It doesn't make it a better home. It simply makes the existing homeowner more wealthy. I've been benefiting from that, but it makes the cost of living really much more challenging. And so here's a stat that summarizes all of that. Across Canada, real estate rental and leasing represents about 14% of our gross domestic product. Fewer than 2% of Canadians make their livelihood in real estate rental and leasing. There is no other industry in our economy that has such a big gap between share of GDP and proportion of employment. And this is a strategy for what I would describe as lazy GDP growth. Sure, we're pumping up the number, and we are driving good standards of living, good livelihoods for disproportionately real estate agents, but everybody else is losing out because everybody else isn't part of an industry that's having the productivity driven up there. So their earnings aren't going up, but their major cost of living is rising and has risen for now decades. Finally, we've kind of stalled it out lately. But that massive gap is causing the biggest deterioration in the standard of living for those who aren't already homeowners. Lazy GDP growth is at the heart of that. Our governments can claim credit when it goes up, that kind of GDP goes up, but we need to have a better sense of what really makes a thriving economy. We need to go, GDP matters, but we got to go beyond GDP in measuring an economy that's really contributing to the quality of life.
So here's some things to think about that I think may have impacted the lack of development that is required because we've had population growth, okay, and we've had not enough housing. But I would question that because we've had not enough housing, and the research that we've done says it's not that we don't have enough housing, is that we live in more per square foot as each human in Canada, in actually US too, but largely in Canada, than they do in these more, I would call them more mature countries. I would claim mainly in Europe. And so as a result, we feel it's okay that, we have two people living in a 3,500 square foot home or et cetera. And whereas if we fix that, then maybe we solve all our problems.
Well, again, there's a few themes you've raised there. One, I want to give a shout out to Steve Pomeroy, who's a researcher in Canada who has drawn attention to data that would question whether or not the increase in the supply of housing has kept pace with our population, and I think some of his numbers suggest that actually it's much more in parallel than some other people would suggest. So just keep that in mind. Second of all, we often talk about having a supply shortage in housing, but some would describe it differently. We actually have a surplus of bedrooms; they're just badly distributed. I think that's what you were just getting there at a moment ago. We have some people who have many empty rooms and some people who are trying to raise their child in a closet because it's hard to afford a bedroom when you're starting out as a 28-year-old. So which is it? Do we have a supply shortage or a distribution of, a surplus of bedrooms badly distributed? It's kind of both and in some regards. I think I wanted to make one other point, and damn it, as I got onto that, what was my one other point? Sorry, listeners.
Surplus bedrooms versus what was the other part?
Exactly. Well, how do we now? Oh yeah, here's my third point. Thank goodness for let me catch up. Maybe you'll edit that out. Right now, Prime Minister Carney is promising to restore housing affordability by saying we're going to build to a scale that we haven't seen in generations. I applaud this. We should be building more housing supply, and I hope we build the right kind of supply, the family-sized housing, etc. I will also point out right now, though, over the last 3 years, housing prices have actually stalled, fallen somewhat, especially when adjusting for inflation. That's good news. We should be cheering that on if we care about affordability. But it hasn't happened with record starts or record completions of new housing. And so we need to recognize that building more housing matters for restoring housing affordability, but it is one factor. It's maybe it's necessary. It's certainly not sufficient. And your earlier observations about how interest rates and monetary policy interact with that and lending practices, they all are interacting. And so we need much more of a sophisticated narrative about restoring housing affordability than just build more supply, because we haven't been building much, and the prices have been stalling and getting incrementally more in reach.
I would argue quite strongly that I think if you just build more housing, it won't work because you need to incentivize the type of housing. So let's take the example. If you or myself, let's go back 20 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years, and say, if I buy a 2-bedroom house at whatever the going price was, and I just hold that for the 20 years, 30 years, 15 years, whatever, I'll make X. But if the individual sees what's going on during this time period, goes, holy shit, I only bought 2. But if I buy a 5-bedroom house, because the property values are going up, you know what? Let me take on more leverage because interest rates are lower and I can afford it. I'll buy a bigger house, bigger than I need, because you know what? I'm going to make money because Johnny made money and Mary made money and I need to make money too. And so that's all that happened. If the interest rates stop going down, which now they basically hit bottom and have bounced back up. We're sitting at 2.25. It's not that much farther to zero. So we're pretty low as it is. So if there's now no more stimulus coming from those interest rates, then how do you solve this? You're going to have people are now going to make different types of decisions. And I'll pull this back and make it relevant. My house today is worth 20% less than it was 3 years ago. So's yours.
So's mine.
Now, thank God this doesn't change my life. I don't need to sell it. I love my house, etc. But it now changes the dynamic of whether I want to buy another house. Because I may now not think I'm going to make money. And then that permeates to everybody else. And also, as a homeowner, I'm pretty upset. There's all these people talking that housing it needs to be more affordable. And it's like, well, the housing should be affordable, but my house
Yes.
is already affordable, Paul. Don't tell me that my house is overvalued. Because I bet my entire life on this house, I'm gonna cash it in, baby, and that's gonna be my retirement.
Well, now you've just described the assumptions at the heart of Canada's political bargain between generations.
Yes, sir.
Politicians of many party stripes, both provincially and federally, have been very hesitant to say, look, if we want to restore affordability, one straightforward way to do is to have those home values really drive down quite a lot and bring them back into, the right proportions for what salaries are paying when people get full-time employment. But of course, the homeowners of the day, who, as you pointed out, are the majority, they don't want to see some big, quote unquote, correction in home values. And so politicians say the following: well, then we're going to ask people trying to get into the market to endure higher rents as they try and save, larger mortgages, or simply experience their dreams of homeownership being dashed entirely. And we're going to oblige you to suffer that lower standard of living, because that's what protects the wealth gained by Paul Kershaw and Anthony and others who've come before. And so we're kind of obliging you to struggle and suffer in the current economy to offer protection for the wealth that's been gained by those before. I understand the political bargain, but man, we need to name the sacrifice we're imposing on the younger generation. We need to name the protection we're demanding of them. And after some point, we ought to be acknowledged, and we ought to compensate them. And I don't think we're not going to be restoring housing affordability for any time soon. But we could ensure that post-secondary didn't cost, such a large amount of debt afterwards. And childcare doesn't need to be another rent size payment. And we could bring down other major costs in people's lives as these younger generations of millennials and Gen Z are enduring the higher rent and mortgages or dash dreams of homeownership to provide that protection. And that's where I think the next national housing strategy has to go. It needs to start with the observation of this intergenerational tension, name the protection we are obliging younger people to provide for the wealth that's been gained by homeowners earlier, and then say, how are we going to ask those who are benefiting from the protection to kind of lean in to be part of the intergenerational solution? They're gaining from the protection. How can they contribute to, address some of the hardship that's coming for those offering the protection? So what do you think about that, Anthony?
I love it. No, I think it's good. So let's think about this. If you look, my parents and your parents, they endured. Like, my parents weren't born here. They came with nothing, and they worked hard and bought real estate and ran a business. And that business turned into a bigger business. And that's how my family grew. And today my sister runs the furniture business, and that's where my dad started. And I started this business. But I think, each generation kind of questions, is this kid he's kind of lazy. Like, every parent looks at the next generation and says, these guys are lazy. They're not going to make it. They're not focused. Is this also just a cycle that we're going through? And just fixing the house. I think it's about, we need better infrastructure. One of the things, if you look at Canada as the major cities in this country, right? When did you get a subway in Vancouver? You still don't have something underground. You have this Pacific Line and so on, which was
the SkyTrain.
The SkyTrain, by hook and by crook, just like in the last really 2 decades. And really, like, if you have you been to Madrid? Have you been to Paris? Have you been to these cities that are like museums? And yet you go under the ground and there's subways everywhere. New York, like, we're so far. What happened as a country is we stopped becoming a country. Wait for it, 1974, when that building, which is right there, CN Tower, was built. After that, we had Finch Station right on the north end, stopped building. no more subways, no more climbing to the moon. And so as a country, we just said, oh, we're good. Everybody came to Canada, built it, we're good. And since then, we've been just milking it. And frankly, we got to refocus on fixing this country's infrastructure, because it's all falling apart. And that's all connected to where are we going to get the taxation? Like, they want to cut development fees. That doesn't make sense. Now I'm going to pay more in tax as a landowner, as are you. Like, there's no magic. We have to pay. The cities are running basically bankrupt now because they don't make money on transactions. If you have no transactions, then you're not generating any revenue. So where's that revenue going to come from? Oh, let's cut the development fees. Okay, magic. Well, now I got a bullseye on my forehead and my back because my property tax has gone up like 20% in the last 2 years, buddy.
Well, there's lots to go in there because we could talk about whether or not growth should pay for growth. But I'd like to take a different theme that you just raised in terms of,
Sure.
like, you know, why aren't we investing in building infrastructure that will, make our cities and economy vibrant? And I think at the heart of it actually is another intergenerational tension. And the tension here is that decades ago, we failed to plan for the predictable costs of population aging. And
Yes.
now, by not planning for the revenue that we needed decades ago to build up the surplus to kind of cover those costs of population aging, we are using all the dollars really produced by economic growth to do so. And there's not enough economic growth to even pay for that. And so we've got these large deficits and it crowds out investments elsewhere. So let me help expand that just in a few minutes of observations. I know that we didn't plan adequately for the predictable costs of population aging, because there is one instance where we actually got it right. In the mid-1990s, then Prime Minister Chrétien made a budget that said we have to plan for Canada Pension Plan to be vibrant when baby boomers get old. Yep. Which is going to mean the following. When baby boomers were young, there were 7 working age people to help subsidize every retiree. Mm-hmm. By the time this big generation reaches retirement, boomers will be a big group in retirement. There'll only be 3 working age people to help subsidize them. The math there is like a Ponzi scheme. And yes. So Prime Minister Chrétien said, boomers, we need to raise the premiums that you're contributing to the Canada Pension Plan so you pre-fund enough of what you will eventually draw down. He raised CPP premiums in the mid-90s by 68% and didn't lose the next election. And today, because of it, the CPP is viewed internationally as a very financially robust pension plan and an intergenerationally fair one. Now, at the same time, we should have done the exact same thing for old age security at the federal level. We didn't. We didn't build up a revenue surplus for that in the years ahead of the boomers retiring. And we needed to do the same thing for medical care, because when you're over 65, the Canadian Institute for Health Information shows you use as much medical care as 4 people under 50. Yep. So medical care is something we consume a lot of as we age. That's not a problem, but not planning the revenue to cover it is a problem. And so now OAS, between 2015 and 2030, annual spending on OAS will be up by over $60 billion. That's pretty much exactly what the federal government is predicting the deficit will be. And at the provincial level, across the country, if today we had the same age distribution as when boomers were young. Back when boomers were young, there's 10% of seniors. Now there are like 20% of our population is seniors. If it remained a younger population like when boomers were young, we'd be spending $66 billion less on medical care each year without changing anything about a provincial budget. And so that's like $120+ billion of costs right there. And Anthony, you're asking, why are we not investing in infrastructure? Because we didn't plan decades ago to have the revenue to cover those predictable $120 billion in costs. And now nothing's left over to do the city building, the economy building, unless we just deficit fund it. And man, the servicing of that debt is costly too.
Okay. Ready? I'm going to solve all the problems. Ready for this? Okay. I'm not a boomer, but I've made money on my house, as of you. Yes. So now I say, you know what? I can now borrow against said house that's made me money, or I can sell it. Even if it's 20% less, I'm still way up from what I paid 17, 16 years ago. And you know what? I want to send my kids to school. I'm going to put them in private school. And wait, I want to get medical care. I don't want to wait in line. And I can afford it. God bless. I'm going to pay for private medical. Now, watch what that does. Free up space in public healthcare. Free up space in public education. All of a sudden, there's no problem there. Next, I have my old age security. Guess what? I have enough to earn. Change it. I don't get anything except for the minimum, which I'm entitled to. I don't get any supplement. I should get what I paid because look, I paid for it. No offense. I think that's not fair. I paid. I should get that back. Or if I choose not to put the money in CPP because I want to do it myself, then allow me to put it in my own situation and I'll cover it. When I get old, I won't have anything, but hey, live by the sword, die by the sword. So there's and now that allows those people, not allows, forces those people that have made profit on an asset which was a depreciating asset. Houses should actually be worth less every minute that we live in them. But of course, all the listeners listening to that, they don't want to hear that, but that's just how it is. You know, the paint is bad, the roof goes bad, the windows, everything deteriorates.
You're describing my house.
So every moment it's worth less, not more. The only thing that appreciates in value is the scarcity of the land. So we magically created scarcity of land because we didn't build infrastructure and expand the TTC and the rest of the infrastructure. Then the people could have lived everywhere and got downtown in the same amount of time.
Well, here's a place where we'll converge and diverge. So let's talk on the OAS one. I'd love to explore that. That's one of the big recommendations, trimming OAS subsidies for retired couples that have six-figure incomes so that we can better spend the dollars on other things. So I want to get into that in more detail. That's a big push for us these days. But I will say that the data don't support your kind of move like, let's have two-tier education or, two-tier medicine. Because the data show that what keeps the quality of public services relatively high is when the vast majority of people are using them, so that the people who have more privilege and resources care about its quality as well. The moment you let those who have some more socioeconomic finances say, I'm not going to send my kids to public school, or I'm happy to opt into a private medical system, then you lose their advocacy to sustain the public systems at a level that they would want for themselves. And that causes both deterioration in the quality in the public services for others who can't afford the other option. And also it tends to be more expensive because the private system will cream the easy cases and then say, oh, even if they have means, we're not dealing with that. Send them back to the public system and you taxpayers cover the costly ones. So that it's quite clear in the data actually that the two-tier approach is inefficient. And if you look at the United States of America, which is the quintessential example of not really having a publicly funded medical care system, they spend 16% of their GDP on medical care, way more than any other industrialized country, and they get the worst outcomes.
How much do we spend?
About 11.5% of GDP. And Australia, I think it's Australia and New Zealand and one other country right now I'm forgetting, which is embarrassing because I have to teach this in a few weeks. They spend around 10% and they have some of the best outcomes anywhere. So we actually are spending more than several other peer countries to get lesser outcomes here in Canada, for what it's worth.
So let's just break apart schooling because schooling is critical. I think if you don't have good schooling, there are a number of stats here, and this is Ontario stuff. There's a huge problem that children are not showing up to school. They actually have now thought through here in the Metro Toronto area that the public system would require attendance and take attendance and keep that as a grade. Okay, they're fighting over whether that makes sense. But I'm going to give you some figures because I love figures too. the increase, the share of of students going to private schools in Canada has been growing steadily, 8% nationally over the last decade. Okay, and so this, I think, takes away strain from the public. Now, I don't have the data to prove that, but if I send my kid to a public school, they don't go to a private school. To a private school, they don't go to a public school. Why not make that a tax credit for me? Now, all of a sudden, you have a thriving private sector, right? Or make there some kind of credit for, we do that for tuition in university, right? But I don't think enough, because university education is so expensive right now, and it's constantly going up, right? And I think if you're going to have a thriving economy, you got to have a population that's educated. We've proven that over time.
So there's no doubt about the
latter.
healthy.
They have to be healthy. This is why I love when you started. You said, we're going to talk about things that health and wealth. It's not just about the house price.
Yeah, so we absolutely need a well-educated population to be economically thriving and to be healthy. Indeed, medical care actually contributes relatively little to our health and well-being. What really drives our health and well-being is the quality of the conditions into which we're born, grow, live, work, and age. And yes. I think we need to be a little bit nervous about the potential enthusiasm you're demonstrating for saying, let's just let those with means go and use more private education for their kids, because it really will create risks to the quality of the public system for the rest of the population, which then, undermines the education they're getting and the skill sets we're trying to instill with them across the board.
Why does it do that? Why?
Because the quality.
If there are fewer students in the class, isn't that easier to teach them and stay more focused, provide more opportunity? They're fighting over how many kids are in the class.
If you continue to have the same resources going into that school system, but as if we're draining more people into the private sector for their schooling or for their medical care, what you're doing is you are not only draining resources to the public system, you're draining political support for those public systems to be high quality. And that's the part as a political scientist that makes me even more fearful still, is that we need the Anthonys of the world to say, damn it, I want my kid to get a good education in this public system. And if you're not there to say public system, be frigging better, and Doug Ford, stop sending so much money into only medical care for the aging population, but then cut the budget for post-secondary and grow the spending for K-12 education very little, and you're not really doing much for early education. If you're not advocating for that, then government doesn't respond. And so that's, I guess I'm here right now challenging Anthony. I want you to be using your influence to make the school system for the vast majority of kids better, and the medical system for the vast majority better. And it takes your advocacy as much as your activity in that system.
This is going to be a tough one. I think if we had there, okay, so right now, if we are in Toronto, I can go to the Cleveland Clinic, pay money, get everything done right away. I can go to MedCan, pay money, get everything done right away. So we don't have a private system here? I think we're kind of kidding ourselves a little bit.
No. I'm the first to say we have a lot of private in our health system in Canada. Whether it's physiotherapy, whether it is prescription drugs, whether it's getting an MRI, let's be clear, absolutely. And, that works for you, that could work for me. And there's a big chunk of the population for whom it won't work. And I guess that's the part where I'm wanting to make the system work for more people, work for everybody. I do think that was part of the Canadian dream, back in 1974, before you said everything went to SHIT. But here, let me make one distinction, because I know we're starting to potentially run out of time.
Yeah.
It is one. Here's where I 100% we're in lockstep. So I think when it comes to having Canadians with or without financial means accessing services, it matters you have like the same price at the door, and then It's a high quality service, and those with more means contribute more in taxes to that high quality service. But when it comes to sending cash subsidies, I absolutely don't understand why we are sending something like old age security to people who do not necessarily need it. So your listeners may know, because you're, often talking about investments and whatnot, but many Canadians don't realize that our old age security system, not the Canada Pension Plan, the old age security system delivers an $18,000 annual subsidy to retired couples that have $180,000 of household income. Now, this is not the CPP that family would have pre-funded, and what they put in, they're now going to draw down. This is simply a subsidy paid from whomever's eligible according to the rules of the day. And the rules of eligibility for OAS are incredibly generous. And one way I know that is I look at the Canada Child Benefit, which delivers income support to families raising kids. And there we start to claw back the income support when household income surpasses $81,000. But we only begin to phase out the old age security when household, retired couples' income surpasses $180,000, a full $100,000 higher. This subsidy to retirees that have six-figure income is costing us $17 billion a year. Let me put that in context. That's twice as much as the entire budget for $10 a day childcare. It was 10 times more than the recent announcement in the spring economic update about we're going to invest in young people in trades. It's many times more than what the most recent spring economic update did for housing. And I don't understand how we justify sending $17 billion in subsidies to retired couples who have six-figure incomes.
I have the answer.
Okay, tell me.
Winston Churchill said that democracy is not the best form of government, but it's the best one we've got. There are more, let's do the math, elderly than there are young. Elderly pay more tax because as they're aging, they're paying more tax. They tend to vote more, and so they get support. I agree with you. It's wrong. Like, I think we listen. If you're going to be a leader and you make a decision, anytime a leader makes decisions, I'm trying to run a company. When I make a decision, somebody wins. Somebody might be less well off, but I don't believe in a zero-sum business and a zero-sum economy. I think that's not the point. We need to live in a period of abundance, and we can be an abundant country because we have more natural resources than pretty much anyone else on earth, and we have an educated economy, population. We have a relatively young economy, demographics, about 42, 43. It's not bad, but it's relative, right? And so if we encourage people to have children by changing the economic support, your $10 a day being one, tax credit more for children. What about having one income tax for a family? Crazy. Remember that guy made that point? Harper, wasn't it Harper that said we should have that? If we did that, all of a sudden everybody would want to get together and say, guess what? If you have a kid, now we're going to give you get more tax credit. And all of a sudden people change. Once you encourage the incentives, change the incentives, people change their actions. I don't believe in taxation to make people, like you can force people to do things by the stick or the carrot, right? I'm all about the carrot because the more carrots that are out there, the more things become an abundance.
Yeah, there's a lot of that I agree with. I think I might want to.
I don't mind if you, Paul, no. Honestly, I don't mind if you disagree. Please, I'm just some Schmo here, and forensic accountant who reads a lot, pays a lot of attention, and we've run 14 years of real estate conferences. That this is near and dear to my heart, the things we're talking about.
So bring me to your next real estate conference. I'd be delighted to contribute that way. I think it would be fun to talk about whether or not income splitting will really stimulate the love life of Canadians these days. But I want to come back to the old age security piece specifically, because I think this is the right kind of place to talk about carrots. I mean, right now, the carrot is this $17 billion subsidy to send tens of thousands of dollars to retired couples each year. 18 grand, I shouldn't exaggerate, 18 grand. And if we just trim that by half, and instead of sending 17 billion, we sent 8.5 or so. First off, we could add $5,000 for every poor senior and lift them above the official poverty measure. We could eliminate seniors' poverty.
Yep.
I could do that, and I'd have billions left over. I could add a $3,000 rent subsidy for 1 million young people struggling in the rental market. I could safeguard the Canada Student Grant for 1 million post-secondary students so that it doesn't get cut by $1,200 next year, as is the current plan. We are going to cut Canada Student Grants for post-secondary students while we are safeguarding an 18 grand subsidy for retired couples that have six-figure incomes, and they probably are also homeowners. Like, those kinds of trade-offs don't make sense for me. I can do all of these other things and still have billions left over if we just start phasing out old age security at $100,000 of household income. Not eliminate it, but just begin to phase it out in the same way that's much more akin to what we do with the Canada Child Benefit. Now, that one change isn't a silver bullet, but it would do more to improve economic security in this country than has been seen in decades. It would do more to kind of relieve pressure on the federal deficit than almost any other option. And I'm desperately hoping that we see Prime Minister Carney and his government do something like that by the 2026 federal budget. Because if we don't, we're just leaving so much cash on the table that could be better invested and to create so many better carrots, to use your language.
So doesn't it then ultimately come down to, if I could, fixing what becomes our objectives as a society? You see, so I'm going to take my accounting hat, right?
Yep.
We want to stimulate small business to grow. What do? Well, the first 500,000 that you make as a business is taxed at a lower rate than the amount that you make above 500,000. Magic. More people want to get in business. Imagine if we said, for every employee that you hire, you collect a certain percentage of their employee health tax, which you have to pay. You have to pay their CPP. You have to pay their EI. You have to collect the HST and then remit it to the government. The government doesn't pay you anything for that. I'm going to take you back to a time in the 90s and prior, when you collected PST, because that was the day before we had PST and when we had it separate, right?
Yep.
The PST was collected here in Ontario, and I had businesses at this time. So I would get to keep a certain percentage of that PST because I was actually acting as a tax collector, right? So now why not incentivize me to hire people in some fashion? Incentivize me to grow a business. Don't give me a subsidy. Subsidies make you lazy, but incentivize me to act. If you act and you make 100, well, you can keep 5. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I give you 5, you know what? I'm going to sit at home and go, why didn't you give me 10? I want 10. Johnny, so many reasons. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I think the broad point, I'm going to be speaking with people at the Business Council not so long from now, and I think they're going to be making the same observation as you. We want small businesses to scale. We want them to no longer remain small. We want them to become medium and larger. Correct. And in the process of doing so, hiring more people. And so I understand the call to think about our tax system for corporations, that as they shift from being small into something bigger, which is what we want, how do we incentivize that more than we're currently doing? The question becomes then, if that requires a bit of an offset, and we're not going to collect as many taxes that way potentially, how do we offset that? And that kind of brings it back to my example of old age security. There are places we are spending huge sums of money right now that are target inefficient, and I think that I think the prime example of that, Exhibit A, is sending these $18,000 subsidies to retirees with 180 grand of household income. And if we can say, let's trim some of that back and ask that group to lean in, we free up billions to do other things, including creating some of the incentives that you were just describing. And maybe I'll end with the very hopeful note that Canadians are ready for this. My lab's done has partnered with a polling firm to see like what do Canadians think about this idea of modernizing old age security to free up billions to spend better and more efficiently. And it turns out 3/4 of Canadians, and most beautifully 3/4 of retirees, support the idea of beginning to phase out OAS at around $100,000 of household income, so that the billions that can be saved can be used to eliminate seniors' poverty, help their kids and grandchildren's generations with affordability, and still have billions left over to address some other pressures. We should do it.
So is that we're gonna, because I did want to leave you with what is that, the magic bullet as you see it that would fix most of the problems. And I want to, we didn't even touch on climate. Should we touch on that? Because I know you've said that we need to have, a climate economy where we're going to charge carbon. And how does that fit into all of this? Because everything is interrelated, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think there's one silver bullet. If you were to ask me what's the first thing you would change, I would modernize OAS in the way that I just described. The second thing I would do is I would launch a better late than never task force to help provinces figure out the revenue problem we have with regards to medical care and boomers aging. It's one thing for me to ask a financially secure boomer to take a smaller OAS subsidy. It's another thing for me to say to that person, please take less cancer care. And I just, that's not something that I'm willing to say to an older person. They deserve the cancer care that our system can provide. So the question is, then how do we come up with the resources to deal with the fact that now we have twice as many people at a life course stage where they use as much medical care as 4 people under 50. It's a more costly time. We need a better late than never task force to plan for it. I wish we did decades ago. I think the metaphor is the best time to plant a tree was 20 or 30 years ago. The next best time is now. So we got to figure this problem out now. But if you want to stretch to the issue on climate, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to try and do it efficiently. I'm someone who believes if you make a mess, clean it up. My mom kind of instilled that value in me. Pollution is a mess. And right now, our policies and our economy, for the most part, let us pollute for free. But there's no such thing as free pollution. It's just, when do we incur the bill? And I think that we betray our kids and grandchildren by asking them to pay dearly for the pollution that right now we're not willing to pay for to some degree as consumers, and we're not necessarily asking our big companies to pay for. So that's both a moral observation. It's also an existential one. The extreme weather that we're witnessing and the scientific evidence about what climate change will deliver in the decades ahead are not only a big threat to us economically, and the Canadian Climate Institute has really shown how climate change is going to be a big hit on our GDP, but it's an existential threat to the health of younger people and future generations. The science shows that the biggest threat to human health in the 21st century is actually climate change. And so that's why you do see in other parts of my work calling on all of us to be open to paying more for the pollution that we make, so that we don't ask our kids and grandchildren to pay more dearly.
It's a heavy one because, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to make one comment and see how you like this one. But Canada is let's just talk oil. We are I think the 3rd largest producer on earth of oil. But we are the 10th or 11th largest emitter in the world, is you just measuring by carbon.
In aggregate.
That's correct.
At a per person level, we're hugely, we're higher than that, yeah.
Sorry, per person, did you say?
Per person level, we're much higher than that.
Agreed.
But in aggregate.
But we live in Canada. The problem of Canada is I'd love to live in the Northwest Territories, or Northern Ontario, but it's cold. It's already too cold in Toronto, let me tell you. Anyway, so are we doing, see, my problem is, this is like the prisoner's dilemma, right? Because, well, do I want to be the one that steps back when everybody else is running full steam, doing whatever they want? I got to be the good guy. And so aren't we hurting our people and helping the rest of the world. Well, the rest of the world, I'm going to share a secret to everybody paying attention. They don't give a shit about us. So let's be clear. We're going to solve, and by the way, I like creating, stimulating thought. So we're going to do all this because it helps the world. Okay, I agree. But in so doing, it puts us behind such that we can't support the kids that go to school, and we can't pay for the old age security and the medical and all this kind of stuff. Crazy.
Yeah, so you could seduce me into a conversation about why we ought to lead and set the right example, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to observe that I think more and more, you could almost describe President Trump to some degree as an accidental environmentalist, because his latest war in Iran, and it's causing the Strait of Hormuz to be clogged in a way that we've not witnessed in my professional lifetime, is actually then driving other countries to be thinking more about renewables, not simply because it's good for the planet's health, but because renewables are sovereign. Oil can get, if you have to deliver fossil fuels thousands of kilometers by boat or what have you, that clearly we have seen can be interfered with as a way to have economic harm done to a country from which we have strife. But, the sun shines domestically, the wind blows domestically. Those are sovereign sources of energy. And I was thinking the other day, I wrote about this in the Globe, that, taxpayers put $34 billion into the TMX pipeline, fine. But then I was like, that was one, nation building project. $34 billion today could probably pay for a fully installed solar system on 1 in every 9 households. And then those 1 in every 9 households, they're getting all the savings themselves from this nation building project. Whereas, when we subsidize the oil pipeline, I know it lets us get our, fossil fuels more to market. But what we're learning from the Strait of Hormuz being closed is that does help, oil companies be more profitable and their employees, staying well-paying jobs. And it does give some taxes, et cetera, to, an Alberta government and the feds. But the rest of us, we're still paying for our gas at the globally set levels. Whereas if you were to have a nation building project that put rooftop solar, in communities from coast to coast to coast, then individual households are actually reaping the benefits from that directly. And I don't think it's either or in this particular case, but I wish we would have more innovation and imagination for what nation building projects looked like when it came to energy, because the numbers do show there's lots of good reasons, both cost reasons, climate reasons, and now sovereignty reasons, to be thinking more and more about renewables.
I think you're right. The one point you said, if you want more renewables, you need to make fossil fuels more expensive. That forces action, because again, you've created an incentive. The fact is, fossil fuels are cheaper, okay, or have been historically.
They have, yeah. I think people would challenge that now, but yes.
Yeah, that's right. They have been, and they've been very plentiful. The amazing thing is, in this country, we have sovereign, secure energy, and we have more than we need, and we can export it, make money, and take that money and invest in renewables. Last thought.
If only we did the latter part, I would be especially excited. But yes, last thought to you.
Something. The TMX is going to go public, okay? Newsflash. Yep. When they sell it, they will apparently, the rough estimates is that they're going to accumulate somewhere between 33 and 35 billion, which is how much they invested. So frankly, this is a fantastic investment. They didn't make a profit necessarily, but they employed people to build it. That is a return. Those people that were employed paid tax. That was a return. We don't everything in economics depends on how you measure the outcomes. It's not just, you measure outcome by profit, cost, and revenue. There's other benefits that happen. Anyway, I'm preaching to the economist here, but this is a problem we have as a society when we think about, what benefits come from things.
And this takes us back to an earlier part of our conversation where was talking about GDP, and I think GDP is a really important economic indicator, and we need to go beyond GDP and thinking about other indicators that really tell us when we're growing our economy in ways that that realistically improve the standard of living, create the abundance in the way that you're describing. And abundance is both an economic issue and a broader quality of life issue.
Paul,
So wrap us up here,
leave
Anthony.
it there. I want to leave it there. We'll have another discussion focused in the fall as more things are happening. We'll see what Carney does. Tell us the book that you want to share with us. Your favorite book.
Oh yes, right. I almost forgotten. Okay. Well, if I was staying on point about generational issues, I would draw your listeners' attention to The Fourth Turning is Here by Neil Howe.
Love that
You've
book.
got your thumbs up. Love that book. Maybe you've talked about it before, but it's all about generations and sort of cycles between generations. And this fellow is just got an encyclopedic knowledge of history and then uses it to forecast for the future. And man, does he do it in an impressive way. But the book that's really blowing my mind actually is called The Light Eaters by Zoe Schlanger. And this is not at all about investments, but it's a great book summarizing the science about how plants, the science is increasingly showing plants see, they hear, they feel, they are, they're protective of their own kind and their own kin. And it's raising crazy questions about literally the consciousness of plants. And in my life, I have a small little hobby farm. I grow most of the food that we eat, and it's just blowing my mind at how I look at the trees and the plants and the things around me as I sometimes cut them down, as I sometimes harvest them. Anyhow, mind-blowing book, The Light Eaters.
I love it. I'm going to give a shout out to someone we've had here on the podcast and a great friend of Veritas, Mark Cullen. He is, one of the most famous gardeners in Canada, and he has written numerous books. His last book was about gardening and how much it's just like economics. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
I love that.
It's a fantastic book. And your favorite breakfast spot that you like to go to, and your favorite breakfast?
That's also easy. As I've just shared, I do have a little farm. So my favorite breakfast place is right here at home, when I can go and pick up the eggs myself and, cut down the whatever greens I'm going to have with it. And the fruit that whether it's the raspberry, the blackberry, the apple, whatever time of season it is. And in the fall, I can even press my own freshly squeezed apple juice. Now that, when I have the time to do it, is where I want to go for breakfast.
I'm calling you when I'm next out in Vancouver. I love that idea.
Sounds great.
Paul, thank you for your time. Please keep up the good work, pushing and trying to make this country better.
Thank you very much. And thanks for a great talk today on your podcast. Really enjoyed it.
Me too. Thanks, everyone. All right. Well, that was great, Paul. Hopefully you enjoyed the push.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, that's modest pushing. So I'm happy to push more and more. Yeah. That's modest pushing. And I didn't know that you had a regular housing event. I'd love to learn more about it and think about how I can contribute in the future.
Okay. Well, we'll follow up with that. And I don't think that this government, we need to overhaul everything. The tax system, the social service system, everything needs to be rethought, because everything we're doing, I think, is antiquated, needs attention.
Yeah, and I think that applies.
People are leaving this country.
And that applies as much to the Ontario government as it does the federal government.
So modern economic and social realities. Rethink.
All right, take care, Paul. All the best.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.